There's been some very disturbing news lately in the news about a rabbi who was arrested for planting hidden cameras in the mikveh. And I think that when something shocking like that happens among our people, it's time to sort of review Halakhah. As a matter of fact, like one of the things that I was speaking to some of the rabbinic leadership at the RCA, and my suggestion was that when one of our own does something like that, it's sort of an indication that we need to go back to the basics. And instead of learning about how to best prepare a sermon and how to do business administration in your synagogue, we have to start going back to things like Yirah Shamayim, and because the rabbinate is also susceptible to those kinds of shortcomings and forgetting the basics. But obviously, we have to understand that there are halachic violations as well as legal violations involved in invasion of someone else's privacy. And there are two aspects of the prohibition of being a peeping Tom. One, it has to do with a general principle called hezek re'iyah, which is injuring or causing someone else an invasion or an intrusion of their privacy, which is considered to be a form of damage in halacha. And that's true even if what you're viewing that the other person is doing is private, but not necessarily anything having to do with exposure of their body in any sense. Okay? But it's just an intrusion. And then the other part, of course, is the obligation for a person to protect his eyes from prohibited viewings of things. And that, of course, speaks to the obligation for a person to distance himself from committing any form of sexual crime, even by viewing things that could lead him to desire and so forth. So what I wanted to do is we'll just start tonight and we'll see how far we get. The Aruch HaShulchan in Choshen Mishpat Siman Kuf Nun Dalet sort of summarizes for us a very long sugya in the Gemara, which is the whole concept of hezek re'iyah. The first chapter of Bava Basra has a lengthy discussion as to whether or not we say hezek re'iyah shmei hezek or not. Is visual damage considered to be a damage for which you can coerce someone to prevent the damage or not? Can I force my neighbor to build a wall in a situation where his presence is an invasion of my privacy because he can see my private activities in my backyard or in my house? So the Gemara's conclusion is that we paskin that hezek re'iyah is shmei hezek to the point where I can coerce a neighbor to build with me a barrier to prevent him from looking into my private property. And this has practical applications. If you move into a home and you have activities that you're engaging in, and in your backyard, and you don't want your neighbor to be able to look in, you can actually coerce your neighbor to either to help you to share in the costs of building a barrier to prevent the neighbor from having a visual access to your activities. So the Aruch HaShulchan says in Sivav, in Siman Kuf Nun Dalet, this is source number 1, Kaimelan de hezek re'iyah shmo hezek. Derov b'nei adam makpidim k'sha'acher mabitim v'ma'aseim u'v'tashmishim u'v'malachta. He says the reason why we paskin the hezek re'iyah is considered to be hezek is because most people do not want others looking in and seeing what they're doing and their different utilities and their different kinds of work. And the reason is quite interesting. The reason is not because of just a sort of a sensitivity, but the reason is because people feel very self-conscious that when you look in and see what I'm doing, you can actually compromise the effectiveness of my work product. He says, the ayin hara sholeit ba'habata sacherim. He says, because there's an ayin hara. People believe in an ayin hara because ayin hara is an actual thing. Now, whether you can be very rational about the concept of ayin hara, And you can say, well, Ayin Hara is psychological. When I see, when other people start looking at me, what I'm doing, I feel very self-conscious, and it affects my ability to be productive. So that's one way of looking at an Ayin Hara. But most poskim actually, in their discussion of the whole concept of Ayin Hara, look at it as an ontological reality. And that is that when you look at me in any kind of negative way, so then you, as a Tzelem Elokim, do have a certain creative power that can actually affect me by looking at me in an untoward fashion. So people realize that, people are sensitive to that, and no one wants their efforts to be compromised by another person's untoward gaze. Okay. So v'amru Chazal, de'asur lo la'adam lamod al sidei chavero b'shah shehi omedes b'kamoseha. So therefore, our sages tell us that even when the least private of activities is taking place, your corn is growing in your backyard. Our sages tell us that you should not stare at your neighbor's corn growing because of this phenomenon called Ayin Hara. So it's really got nothing to do with human initiative. It's got nothing to do with you compromising my efforts psychologically. This has to do with an ontological reality that by you looking at my crops, you could actually in some way compromise their ability to grow effectively. V'od darshu al pasuk devehisir Hashem mimcha kol choli. Also Chazal tell us on the pasuk that one of the blessings that the Torah grants us is that God will remove from you any illness. And what Chazal say is zu Ayin Hara. They say that God will remove from you the Ayin Hara. So you see that Ayin Hara is a reality. Va'od. And another thing, the Aruch HaShulchan says as to why Hezek Re'iyah is called Hezek. He says, Deyesh harbe malachos v'tashmishim hatzrichim tznius. That there are a number of activities that in order for them to be done effectively do require a certain sense of modesty and privacy. Ucheshe'acher mabit mona'o me'asiyaso. And when someone else is looking on, it actually in some way compromises my ability to do the job well. Now, I believe what he's referring to is the fact that sometimes when you're a skilled laborer, you need concentration and privacy. It's as a moil how difficult it is to perform in front of a crowd. I mean, I'd like to see some surgeons have to do surgery in front of a group of 100 unruly Jews, put with their, schmoozing while these things are going on. In other words, a surgeon needs privacy when he's doing surgery because it helps him concentrate better when he knows that he doesn't have a thousand eyes looking at him, right? So there are certain kinds of work activity that require a certain level of concentration and privacy in order for them to be done effectively. Va'od kaimalan, diyesh chazaka lehezek re'iyah. He says there's also something called the chazaka. And he goes on to discuss what that idea of chazaka means. It means that if after a time a neighbor has already demonstrated his ability to live with other people looking in on his property, he cannot all of a sudden decide that he doesn't want it anymore. So he goes into a lengthy discussion of determining what that length of period is, and he concludes that it's a 3-year period. If after 3 years you've lived with a neighbor who has full view of your backyard, and all of a sudden you want to decide that now I want my privacy, you're not entitled to that anymore. It's only when you're first putting up the two properties adjacent to each other. So we have this concept of Hezek Re'iyah that's discussed in the Gemara, and Chazal have this tradition, and this is how it's paskined in the Rishonim, that this is something that a person can be, there doesn't seem to be damages that can be collected for Hezek Re'iyah. I can't take a guy to Beis Din and say, well, because you looked at my work product, I wasn't able to make as beautiful a sculpture or as beautiful of a chair as I wanted to, and therefore I'm going to sue you. That we don't find in the poskim. But what we do find in the poskim is I have the legal ability to prevent you from peeking in and looking into the things that I'm doing. But there's another aspect of this as well, which is based on the pasuk in Chumash. It says that when Bilam was getting ready to curse the Jewish people, it says, Vayisa Bilam es einav, that he lifted up his eyes. Vayaris Yisrael shochein lishvatav. He saw the tribes, he saw the Jewish people encamped according to their tribes. Vatihi alav ruach Elokim, and there was upon him the Spirit of God. So Rashi famously tells us, Shochein lishvatav, Ra'a kol shevet v'shevet shochein la'atzmo ve'inan me'uravim. So the first thing that he saw is that people were organized properly. This goes back to our discussion, which we learned last week, about when Yovel is Noheg and when Yovel is not Noheg. We said that there has to be a sense of organization, that the tribes have to be apportioned properly. So that's the first thing that he saw. He saw that there was a sense of Seder, a sense of order to the Jewish people. But then the Rashi says something else. He says, Ra'a she'ein pischei mechuvanim zeh keneged zeh, shelo yatzitz letoch ohel chavero. He also saw that the doorways of each person's tent was arranged in such a way that no two doors of two tents would be facing each other, so that people would not look in to see what the other family was doing. And the Panim Yafos in his Torah commentary explains, Vayayisol shechein l'shvatav, he says, V'amru Chazal, Ra'a she'ein pischei mechuvanim zeh keneged zeh, v'amar re'uyin heim libracha. As a result, the Panim Yafos is really just continuing this medrash that Rashi is quoting. As a result of his noticing that they didn't have doorways facing each other, he said that they are therefore worthy for blessing. In Yano, he says, let me explain this to you. He says, Ki kilalas adam harishon haya al yedei hakina vehataiva vehakava. He says, what was Adam Harishon's original sin? His original sin was because of jealousy, of desire, and of this need for honor. That these three character traits remove a person from this world. And if we were to study the original sin story, the story of Adam and Chava, we would see that it was a combination of these three components to the human personality that really drove Adam and Chava to sin. He says what is accomplished when the doorways are not positioned opposite each other of two different families is that removes jealousy. And v'shelo yisava b'shel re'ehu, it also removes the taiva, it removes the coveting and the desire of that which your fellow has. V'shelo yisga'eh yishel re'ehu, and it also removes this sense of honor, this drive for one-upmanship. Okay? So, in a sense, this mandate that the Jewish people imposed upon themselves to not allow themselves to look into their others' homes also involved character refinement as well. Understanding that the root of all evil lies in looking over the fence of your neighbor and seeing what the other one has, and then discovering all the things that you want and that you don't have, and that your jealousy and all of these other things. That also is something that is very injurious to the individual who allows himself to peek into someone else's property. So we have this, the source of this Rashi that we just quoted is the Gemara in Bava Basra. There's a Mishnah that says, and this Mishnah appears quite late on the scene, after the Gemara has already discussed this ability that you have to coerce your neighbor to share the cost of erecting a wall or a fence to block his ability to to block his view into your property. And much later on, the Gemara and Daf Samech, the Mishnah and Daf Samech says, Lo yiftach adam lechatzer hashutfim pesach keneged pesach v'chalom keneged chalom. So that if two people share a courtyard, they should make sure not to build their structures such that there will be windows that are exactly opposite each other or doors that are exactly opposite each other. Haya katan lo ya'asenu gadol, echad lo ya'asenu shenayim. And also similarly, if there was only a small window that was open to the view of your neighbor, you should not enlarge it. And if it was one window, you should not make it into two, etc., etc. And then the Mishnah qualifies it and says, if, however, there was a public thoroughfare running between you and your neighbor, so then there's no problem of having a full view of your neighbor's property, because since the public has view of it, obviously there's no harm in you having view of it. But the Gemara asks the question, Minahani Mili, which is the next paragraph. This is in source number 5 in the second paragraph. Minahani Mili, from where do we know this idea? And really the Gemara's question is much deeper than from where do we know this idea that Hezek Re'iyah Shemei Hezek, because that's already been discussed by the Gemara, that it's a form of damage that is actionable upon. But as you'll see, the Gemara is asking a deeper question. So, Amar Rabbi Yochanan da Amar Kra, Because the pasuk says, "Vayisa bilam es eina vayar Yisrael shochem lishvatav," that he saw the Jewish people encamped according to their tribes. Mara, what did he see? Ra shem pischei alayim mechuvadim zelazeh. He saw that their doorways were not opposite each other. And Omar ru'in halalu shetashre alayim shechina. He said that these people are worthy of having the divine presence rest upon them. Now, the Yad Ramah, who's one of the Rishonim in the 12th century, has a very interesting insight into this statement of the Gemara. He says, Hare Amru, so first he quotes the Gemara, and he says, so that's just takes us to the bottom of page 1. Let's just turn the page, where the Yad Ramah just quotes the Gemara. And he says as follows. He says, Miha Shaminan, Debeha, he says, we can adduce from this Gemara that when it comes to constructing a window that will open up into your neighbor's property to give you full view of what's going on in his home, he says, he says that there's also a prohibition involved. It's not just an issue of damage. Because let's remember, the difference between Choshen Mishpat and Yoredeya, conceptually, is that when it comes to laws of Choshen Mishpat, which have to do with financial laws and damages, if both parties are consenting to let things be as they are, there's no problem, right? In other words, if I'm stepping on your foot, and you say, please, by all means, step on my foot, it doesn't bother me, then the injured party has cannot take legal action against me, even though I'm stepping on his foot. And the same thing is true with all actionable or all offensive items that are contained in Choshen Mishpat. If the parties are consenting, you can't say, well, what you're doing is wrong. No, because we're dealing with financial matters. So if, for example, I want to charge you $1 million for a widget, which only cost me 50 cents to make, as long as I disclose to you that it only cost me 50 cents, but I want you to pay $1 million for it, and if you say, okay, I'll give you $1 million for it, and I'm happy to do it, and I know full well that it's only worth 50 cents, as long as both parties are consenting, there's no Isser Ona'ah, right? Because Ona'ah means deceiving a person and ripping them off. That's a classic example. When we go to Yoredeya, we find a different genre of halacha. It's irrelevant whether the two parties are consenting adults or not. That aspect of halacha is that these things are absolutely on a moral level wrong, regardless of whether the two people are consenting or not. And so what the Yad Ramah is telling us is that not only is there an issue of financial damage involved in the idea of being able to see into someone else's property and seeing what the other person is doing, but also there's a prohibition, there's a moral issue here, which on an absolute level is deemed wrong by the Ribono Shel Olam. And therefore, he says, it has to do with privacy. It has to do with privacy, especially when it comes to the opposite gender. That you have to respect the fact that there's an issue of privacy, that you have to respect people's privacy. To the point where even if people have been living this way for years, where, my neighbor has an open window to his bedroom that I can easily see into, all these coming-of-age movies from the 80s that you and I grew up with, where the kid's looking out the window one night on a hot summer night and he sees the neighbor's daughter undressing, right? So obviously that's halachically prohibited, even if she doesn't care and he doesn't care. Right? On an absolute level, that's prohibited, according to Halakhah. He says, because if your thinking was that it was only an issue of financial law, why did Bilam say that, because they don't open their doors to each other, they're worthy of the divine presence resting upon them? He says if this was only a matter of tort law, right, of issues of Choshen Mishpat, as long as people are friendly with each other, they don't mind, what difference would it make? It implies that if their doorways were opposite each other, then they wouldn't be worthy of the divine presence. He says, he says, what if two neighbors mutually consent to have their doorways open to each other, to have their windows open to each other? What's wrong? Why are they unworthy of having the divine presence if they're very friendly neighbors and they don't mind if each one has full visual access to the other person's property? So you must conclude, is it morally wrong to forgive damages that your other friend is causing to you? There's no moral imperative to take someone to court for physically damaging you or damaging you in any other way. So therefore we must conclude, this is not something that is subject to being moichel. You can't be moichel something that is morally reprehensible. You can't say, well, I don't mind that you spoke lashon hara about me, and therefore you don't have to do tshuva. Just because I'm moichel, you still have to do tshuva for it because it's morally reprehensible. If you steal from me, I can be moichel you, but it's still morally reprehensible. You have to do tshuva for that act as well, and therefore there's no heter to go ahead and speak lashon hara about me just because I give you permission to do so. Well, he told me he doesn't mind, so I can speak lashon hara about him. Of course not. If something is inherently morally reprehensible, you can't say, well, just because the other person doesn't mind, it's okay for me to do it. So you see from this Gemara, the way that the Yad Ramah explains it, that two neighbors don't even have the right to go ahead and be exhibitionists, shall we say, and allow their neighbors to freely look into their property. So by the time we get to the Rav Shulchan Aruch, and as I mentioned to you in a previous shiur, the Rav Shulchan Aruch has on Choshen Mishpat is an excellent way to learn Hilchas Choshen Mishpat because he only has 15 chapters on all of Choshen Mishpat, which gives practical halacha for the layperson on how to live your life according to the laws of Choshen Mishpat. And so therefore the Rav Shulchan Aruch has 3 seifim on this halacha of Hezek Riyah. So we'll just run through those 3 halachas. This is in Hilchos Nizkei Mamon, and the monetary damages, and he has 3 seifim, Yud Aleph, Yud Beis, and Yud Gimel, which deal with the prohibition of injuring someone visually. So let's take a look what he says. In Sif Yud Aleph he says as follows: Asur la'amod al sdei chaver lihistakel ba b'shashi omedes b'kamoseha shelo yazikena ba'ayin hara. So first he tells us that you're not allowed to stand by your friend's field while the crops are growing so that you not damage the crops through an ayin hara. Okay, ve'ein sarach lomar she'asur lihistakel b'chavero binyan sheish lachush sheyazikena ba'ayin hara. And it goes without saying that if I can't even look at my friend's crops while they're growing, then certainly to look at my friend contemptuously in a way that's going to give him an ayin hara, I'm not allowed to do. This, of course, is what I'm supposed to draw from this as a kal v'chomer. Va'afilu ba'asakavu ma'asav shel chavero she'ein bahem chashash hezek ayin. He says, but even when it comes to certain business activities or just general activities that my friend does, where you don't have to worry that there's going to be an ayin hara. Im osa bevesu v'rshuso asur liros shalom midato. But if he's doing these things in the privacy of his home, you're not allowed to gaze inside his house unless he is fully aware of it. Ki shema eino chafet sheyedu mima'asav u'me'asakav. Because maybe he doesn't want you to know that he walks around the house in pink Speedos or whatever. I don't know what spandex or whatever the guy's whatever he likes doing in the privacy of his home. He doesn't want people to know that that's what he's doing. So even though there may not even be anything halachically wrong with what he's doing in the privacy of his home, but why are you smiling, Craig? Did I pick on something that you do at home? But no, the point is that you never know. So in other words, just because a person is not doing anything wrong, just because a person is not doing anything wrong in the privacy of his home, he does. There's certain things I like doing privately, and even those objectively, there's nothing wrong with it. Fine, I like playing with like toy soldiers, boom, 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 or with my G.I. Joe dolls. Whatever I like doing in the privacy of my home, which looks a little silly to the rest of the world, I don't want people to know about it. And therefore, I have a right to my privacy, and therefore, al pi halacha, unless I give you permission to look on what I'm doing in my home, you don't have the right to do so. Leficha, and as a result, Shnayim shedarim b'chatzer echas v'heim aniyim she'en yadam maseges livnos kosel be'emtza hachatzer lechalka lishnayim shelo yira echad b'ma'asav ve'asakav shel chaveiro shemishtamesh b'chatzer. So he says, therefore, if you have two people that are new residents to a courtyard, and they don't have the financial wherewithal to construct a full-blown wall to be able to divide so that there'll be a visual partition between their two activities, he says they have a right to actually accept charity funds in order to build the flimsiest of structures to be able to create that visual barrier. And if even that they can't do, then they have to do their utmost to make every effort to avoid looking into the other person's activities. Obviously, that's easier said than done. But you have to sort of every time you go outdoors, you have to make sure you're not going to be intentionally gazing at what your neighbor is doing. He says it goes without saying that even, obviously a non-neighbor who just happens to be walking by is not allowed just to look over his friend's backyard fence just to see what he's doing. And for sure, not to look into a window of his home that the neighbor may not even be aware is visible to the street. And this is true even if the neighbor in the house sees you looking into his house, right? And he's aware of the fact that you're looking in, and he says nothing, and he does not object. You're still not allowed to. And he says, you know why? Because Shema mitbayesh lo marlo. Maybe he's embarrassed. I don't want to tell you not to look inside when I'm playing with my toys. Va'afilo nosam al chaver reshus livtoach chalon lechatzer lo nitna lo ela le'ora. And he says, and even if your neighbor gives you permission to open up a window that will have view of his courtyard, he's only giving you permission to allow light to come into your property. He's not giving you permission to have free view of everything that he's doing. And so therefore you have to respect the person's privacy even when you have a full view of that person's property. Okay, that's Sif Yud Aleph. And he goes on to Sif Yud Beis. Ulefichach, asur liftoach Pesach keneged Pesach, v'chalon keneged chalon, shelo yireh echad ma'asav shel chaveiro. And therefore you're not allowed to open one window opposite your neighbor's window so that the two neighbors can see what the other one is doing. Va'afilu shneim misratzim yesh osrim. He says, and even if both parties are consenting to this arrangement of being able to look into each other's affairs, yesh osrim, there are those who prohibit, and he's referring to the Yad Ramah's interpretation. He says, she'ein zu midas tznius she'yireh zeh tashmishav shel zeh kol hayom. Because that's not tznius. There's a moral reprehensibility to this action. The Amru Chachamim Vayisa Bilam Esena Vayarsel Shechin Shvatav Ra'a Shein Pischei Olem Lechubanim Zeh Keneged Zeh Amru Imalo Shekashalem Shechina. He quotes, of course, the famous Gemara with Bilam. Va'afilu Rishus Harabim Mafsekes Beineihem Asrum Liftoch Chalon Keneged Chalon Im HaChalonos Gevahos Shein Bnei Rishus Harabim Yecholom Liros Bahen Derech Hilucham. That he says, now, even though the Mishnah had told us that when there's a public thoroughfare dividing between two neighbors' property, like I have a neighbor on the other side of the street, let's say. So is there anything wrong with me looking into his window as our windows are opposite each other? He says it's prohibited if the windows are so high that people who are walking on the street normally can't see what's going on. So then it's also prohibited. You have to sort of create some kind of shade or blind in order to be able to prevent the neighbor from or prevent yourself from being able to see what's going on into his property. And therefore he says, "V'karkos batem hein gavos mikarka rishus harabim shen yichom liros behem avolim bnei rishus harabim yichom liros behem derech hilucham ein lachush afilu b'chalon eged chalon." He says, however, if the windows are on the ground level, so the point where people who are walking on the street can see into the windows, so then even though my window is opposite my neighbor's, it's perfectly fine. Because then he's going to have to be, he won't be able to exhibit things that are private in front of that window because of the passers-by on the street. So you don't have to worry that he may do something private in front of that window and that you have to shield yourself from. Okay, fine. Let's go on to Sif Yud Gimel. Yesh omrim shetzarich adam lizaher mila'amod keneged beit chavero chatzero v'lirot bo afilu re'iyah kala she'eno mitkaven klal lihistakel leida'as akav shel chavero. There are those who are of the opinion that a person has to be careful not to even casually walk past the person's house and look inside and see what he's doing, even if your intention is not to take a full-blown gaze to what your neighbor is doing. But you have to be extra careful and sensitive that if you know that your neighbor has an open window, let's say open to their kitchen, open to their living room, you have to be extra cautious to dafka avoid looking in. And he says, Elayachzor panav kishiyamod keneged beito chatzero shel chavero, kedei shelo yachshedeu chavero shamidkaven liistakel leida'as akav. And the reason why you have to do this is dafka look the other way when you're walking past your friend's house, is because otherwise you may arouse suspicion in your neighbor. Because he'll see you walking past his house, and looking by, as you're walking by, and he'll say, it's a looky-loo, a peeping Tom. This guy just wants to know my business. And it's going to create enmity and suspicion. V'yeh nitfas kaganav, keven she'en lo ta'ana lamahu mistakel. And he'll accuse you or assume you're trying to what's the word when you want to case the joint? You want to be able to look in and see what he's got in his house. Let me see what kind of silver candlesticks he has in his house. What kind of nice things. She says, "She'af b'nei reshus harabim einu reshaim lamod listakel ela kishron riyakala derech hilucham ein lachu sherei mizeh ein yachol lizaher v'tzarich liyos tzanua b'tashmishav sheyakala b'hem kashe alav." He says, all passers-by are not able to, are not going to be able to stay there for any extended period of time because they're walking through the street. He says, but you, when you're walking by your friend's house, even if you're pausing momentarily, you have to make sure to shield your eyes from your friend's house so that he not suspect you that you're doing something untoward by looking in. So this, in a nutshell, are the laws of Hezek Re'iyah. That number one, you're allowed to demand privacy from your neighbor. Number two, you're not allowed to, even when both parties are consenting, have visual access to a neighbor's property when it's into his house in a place where he's going to be doing private activities. All of these things fall under the rubric of Hezek Re'iyah, and as the Yad Ramah taught us, there's both a financial issue involved, plus there's a moral issue involved as well, which extends beyond the laws of Choshen Mishpat. Okay?
Is there any responsibility on the person in the house to not put people in that position, or by practically speaking, coming home from shul, if a family does not close their shades, does that mean that they don't care, and therefore it's not an issue? So it's not a question of mechila here. The question is they're not doing anything that's not. It's not a question.
Right. It's a very good question. Right. It seems that when it comes to things that are done, let's say on the ground floor in a public living, in a shared living room space or a shared kitchen, it seems that those would be less problematic than things that are done upstairs in a bedroom, let's say. So even the Yad Ramah's whole argument of the morally wrong aspect of having windows facing each other have to do with the idea of tznius. But if there are certain activities that don't require tznius, like sitting in a living room and things like that, it seems like it's less problematic, and there's not necessarily the responsibility of a family to shield the public from activities that don't require tznius. Obviously, there's also there's beyond the halachic issues. There's probably the issue of menschlichkeit, and when you're engaged in things in your own home, you should want to be able to. You don't want to expose yourself to the outside, but here we haven't seen that there's a halachic responsibility to shield others from seeing you doing mundane activity. Although it seems that there's an assumption, like the Aruch HaShulchan said, there's an assumption that the average person doesn't want people to look in. So like Lazer is asking, well, what do you do in a situation where this guy is clearly doesn't mind. He builds this huge glass window facing the street, and in the front, right where his dining room is, where he's watching TV every night, there's certain neighbors you can walk by. The whole street is lit up by his LED television. So he's watching TV. So is there a requirement to actually avert your gaze while you're walking by, if clearly the guy's doing it with almost like an invitation to look inside?
If it's a current NFL game, you're supposed to watch, right?
What's that?
If it's a current NFL game,
if it's a current NFL game, maybe he's doing a chesed to the Shomer Shabbos people in the neighborhood. He wants you to be able to see the score.
There's a problem here in Thornhill, especially because you're so close to the sidewalk. Sometimes you just want light, but by virtue of raising your blind to get light, you're so close to the sidewalk that people walking by can look in your house. You have to be careful what you're doing in your house.
Right.
Should be careful what you're doing in your house.
Right.
Yeah.
Is it just a personal property, or is it a communal property as well?
It seems like we're dealing with private property. Communal property, the assumption is you're not going to be doing any private activities on communal property anyway.
Exactly, yeshiva, right? You're in a dorm and...
Well, the dorm is considered to be private property. Once it's leased to you, it's in a sense the dorm room of a yeshiva bungalow is his private apartment space.
So a dorm counselor can't walk in on that individual without consent, is that what you're saying?
That's a good question. No, not necessarily. There are still things that are considered to be private apartments where a landlord has a right to search and seizure. And I guess a yeshiva, a dorm room would qualify as that as well. It is private, so the dorm counselor has a responsibility to knock before bursting into the room. That's derech eretz. We learned from the Kohen Gadol that even a parent, even though the parent owns the whole house, every individual has an obligation to knock on the door, mishum derech eretz, before he comes into the room. We learned that from the Kohen Gadol's the bells on the bottom of his me'il, right? So, but as far as the ability to have rights of entry, that we're not discussing now. Okay, so let's now take a look at another Gemara. This is Gemara in Masechah Shabbos. So we're shifting gears. Up until now, we've been discussing a halachas in Choshen Mishpat. And these halachas of Choshen Mishpat, we said, extend beyond Choshen Mishpat because there are certain things that are morally reprehensible, which is to look into private activities because it's an invasion of someone's tznius.
Are you allowed to hire somebody to do this for you? For instance, a private investigator investigating something notorious. I'm not talking about something frivolous, but if somebody suspects that somebody is
having an
ripping
affair
them off or
right.
Other kinds of things.
Well, each situation has to be discussed. If a spouse suspects that the other spouse is having an affair, then it is legal to do that with halachic guidance in order to be able to know whether this person is permissible to you as your spouse anymore, or whether they're being faithful to you or not. And the same thing would be true, I believe, in a business as well. If you feel that someone is stealing from you, to be able to spy on them, not to be able to invade their privacy, but rather to discover the facts.
It sounds like a situation in Los Angeles a couple of years ago with the guy bringing treif meat in the back.
Right, so setting up the cameras, yeah.
Somebody was
right.
watching them.
Right.
But that's not a private. Is that a private facility? A store that's open to the public?
Well, you might argue that the shipping dock of a person's business would be private also, because maybe he's doing certain trade activities there that he doesn't want other people to see. But it seems like that if there is grounds for suspicion of criminal activity, then maybe with the participation of the police it would be okay. But that's something that we'd have to. I don't have any tshuva specifically on that particular issue. Okay. Tana Devei Rabbi Yishmael is the Gemara in Masechah Shabbos on Daf Samach Daled. Mipnei ma hutzruchu Yisrael sheba'oso hador kapara. The Torah tells us that when the generation getting ready to enter into Eretz Yisrael went to war against Midian, they needed some level of atonement. And why did those soldiers that went to war require atonement? Mipnei shazanu einehem min ha'erva. Because their eyes were nourished from nakedness. And this is the Gemara's euphemism for saying that they enjoyed viewing women in various levels of undress. Because when they went out to war and they took captives, there were certain women in certain levels of undress that they took as captives, and they actually enjoyed seeing beautiful women in various levels of undress. And therefore they needed a kapara for that very act, because as we see, part of the spoils of war that they took were various different kinds of adornments that are placed on very private parts of the body. Amar Rav Sheshes mipnei ma mana hakastuv tachshitin shebachutzim tachshitin shebifnim. And therefore the Gemara continues along that line of reasoning. When you look at the pasuk, it says tabas, kumaz, and all of these different kinds of jewelry that women wore. Some of them were worn as chastity belts, and some of them were worn as external jewelry. Why are they all grouped together? The Gemara explains, Lamar lacha kol hamistakel be'etzba ketana shel isha kilu mistakel b'makom hatorfa. This is to teach you that if a person even looks at a little pinky of a woman with the intention of admiring her beauty, so then this is as if you're looking at her most private of parts of her body. Another Gemara in Bava, now going back to Bava Basra. Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishom Rabbi Bena'a, Bakol Shutfen Ma'akvim Ze'ezeh Chutz Min HaKevisa. That if you share a courtyard with a neighbor, and you feel that the work that he's doing in the courtyard is going to cause some type of damage to the property, you're allowed to send him a cease and desist order. So let's say you have a neighbor who's drilling, and you feel that the drilling on his property is eventually going to damage your property, or it's a shared space, and you feel that he's engaging in the mixture of certain chemicals and they're creating noxious fumes. Right? So you're allowed to forcibly cause him to cease and desist, except for one activity, which is what? A laundromat. If your neighbor wants to set up a laundromat in a private courtyard and you share that courtyard with him, you cannot coerce him to cease and desist. And the reason is, she'ein darkan shel benot Yisrael li'itbazot al hakivisa. The reason, and the Rashbam explains this also, we have the Rashbam in front of you in source number 10, is because the alternative to women doing the laundry on a private property is for them to have to go to some public area, like the river, to do the laundry. And that's not honorable for a woman to do. It's not honorable for a woman to do the laundry in a public area, because invariably, it's not like you put the wash in the Maytag. They have to go into the water, they have to roll up their sleeves, roll up their pantaloons, and therefore it causes them to be at different levels of exposure that you normally would not be appropriate. And therefore you have to accommodate a neighbor who wants to create a private area for women to do the laundry. Okay. And then the Gemara quotes a pasuk, and it says, V'otseim einav mera'os bira, that fortunate is the man who guards his eyes from seeing evil. Amar Reb Chia bar Abba, so Reb Chia bar Abba said, Zeh she'ein mistakel benashim b'sha'a she'omdot al hakevisa. This refers to a person, the pasuk is praising a person who does not look at women while they're doing the laundry. Let's say if there is a public area where women do the laundry and I'm walking past them, blessed are you for not gazing at them while they're doing the laundry in the river. So the Gemara says, one second, let's try and clarify what this teaching means. Heichi dami, idiika darka achrita rashu. If there's an alternative path for this person to travel, and he davka makes a point of walking by the river every day, then why are you calling him a tzaddik because he doesn't look at the women? The very fact that he chose to go to this path so that he could be nearby the women is not a reason to praise him, it's a reason to condemn him. So rather, says the Gemara, and idaleka darka achrita anusu. And if there's no other way for him to travel, why are you condemning him for looking at the women? Why are you telling him that it's wrong for him to look at the women? because there's no other way for him to go. In order for him to get to his house from where he's coming from, he's got to walk directly past these women. So what else is he supposed to do? So the Gemara answers, La'olam deleka darka achrita va'afilo hachem yiboy le'lameinas nafshi. So the Gemara explains, we're talking in a situation where the only road that you can travel from point A to point B, where you need to get to every day, is to walk past the place where the women do the laundry. And the Gemara says that based on this pasuk in Isaiah, we praise the individual who has an imperative to shield his eyes while he's walking past these women. So obviously there's an evil in peeking in to be a peeping Tom. But there's even a moral imperative to avoid looking at women who are on exhibit in immodest levels of undress. So that's what you see from this Gemara. And the Rambam actually points this out in Hilchos Isurei Bia. It's also quoted in the Shulchan Aruch. And this is in Halakhah Chaf Aleph, in Perek Chaf Aleph. The Rambam writes, he says, V'chein asur la'adam lihistakel b'nashim b'shashem omdod ala kavisa. You're not allowed to look at women when they're doing the laundry. Afilu lihistakel b'vigdei tzemer shalisha shuv makira asur shelo yavo l'dei hirur. And the Rambam goes so far as to say that even to look at a woman's dress, if you know that this is the dress that this particular woman wears, and you're thinking about, how she looks in that dress, even if the dress is on the rack, you're not supposed to look at it because it's going to bring you to sinful thoughts. And that's also considered to be under the rubric of lo sikruvu legalos erba. Do not do anything that's going to bring you close to exposing nakedness. The Meiri on that very same Gemara in source number 12 says, he says, Midas hatznius mishubachas ad lemaod, lo sof davar benashim, ela af ba'anashim. He says the trait of tznius, of being modest, is not something that's reserved just for women. That women have to be modest like they teach in the religious schools. But the midah of tznius applies to men as well. Lo sof davar shelo lechazer achar kalus rosh, and this includes not trying to look for jocular outlets. Ela af lihishtadel harbe alatznius derech harbe alatznius. He says, but also to try and find venues where you can actually put modesty into practice. Derech ha'ara amru otzem enov meraos bera she'eno mistakel benashim b'shash amdas ala kedisa. And as one example, our sages gave us this idea that a person should shield his eyes, create some kind of barrier in front of his eyes if he's walking past women who are doing the laundry. The rabbis were just giving you an example. They said, even when you have no other alternative, I come from Los Angeles, where just driving down Wilshire Boulevard or Sunset Boulevard, you cannot help but be exposed to billboards which display models in different levels of undress. So what the Meiri is saying is that Chazal are giving you an example. Now, obviously, if you were to go like this while you're driving, so that's not a very healthy thing to do. I think that actually what the Gemara is trying to tell you is that this is the virtue that a person should strive for, but there does come a point where you become so inured, so calloused to the environment around you that it becomes just white noise after a while. The Gemara had pointed out when there's another way for you to walk, if you dafka walk by the women doing the laundry, you're called a Rasha. Right? That's what the Gemara had established. So the shaila that he asked, a very practical issue, is lihimana mi p'tichat cheshbon bebank shehapikidot enan levushot sanua. Is it permitted to open an account at a bank where you know that the bank tellers, the very cute bank tellers, are not dressed modestly? Or do you have to dafka go to the bank in Mea Shearim, right? Or Ramallah, where the bank tellers are dressed modestly. That's the shaila that Rav Zilberstein has. He says, She'elaf, hanichnas lebank b'matara liftoch bo b'cheshbon. You have your objective, and when you go into a bank, you want to open an account. V'nochach lirot shahapikidot einan levushot sanua. And it's a very common thing where you notice that the bank tellers are not dressed so modestly. Ha'im chayav lindod lebank acher harachok mi beito. Kemoshe matzina b'masechet bava batra daf nun zayin amud bet. Idi ika drachach min rashu. Like, are you obligated to go to a further away bank from your house where you know that the ladies are going to be dressed modestly in order to open up a bank account there and avoid having to fraternize with the very pretty and not modestly dressed bank tellers. Kolomar, Adam sheyesh lefanav shnei derachim, like we find in the Gemara, you have two ways to walk. Uma'adif la'avor b'derech sheliyad hanahar kasher benot Yisrael amdot sham ala kvisa. And if you choose to walk by the women doing the laundry on your way home from work, even though you try to guard your eyes, Rashahu, you're still called an evil person. Or maybe no. Maybe there comes a point where the burden, where the schlep is so great that if I got to drive all the way out to Mea Sharim and I live somewhere in BAYT Vagan, or if I live in Tel Aviv, I got to drive to Bnei Brak every day to go to the bank. I mean, there becomes a point of unreasonableness. So what is that point where I don't have to be matriach in order to avoid having to deal with the cute bank tellers? So Rav Zilberstein says as follows. He says tshuva. He says, Shamanu b'shem echad migdolei hador shlita shepasak she'ika darka achrina nemar davka kasher shnei hadrachim shavim. He says, I have heard from one of the gedolei haposkim of the previous door that the only time that the Gemara says that you're obligated to circumvent the women doing the laundry is only if the two paths are equidistant to your house. But not when one of them is further. So, and he now goes and brings a raya. We won't go through the whole raya, but you can take a look. He says, let's go to the next paragraph. Ulam nidonenu chamur yoter mehasugya de Baba Batra. He says, but our issue is a little bit more stringent, a little bit more, we have to be more circumspect when we look at the issue that we're dealing with in our case. Shahanidon sham ba'over liyad hanahar b'mikra uva'ofan chad pe'ami. He says, we're talking about a guy who's walking home from work back to his house. It could be a one-time occurrence, and the Gemara says you should avoid walking past the women doing the laundry by the river. And that's going to be where you're just walking past quickly. He says, but in this case, you're not just walking past women doing laundry when you go to the bank. You're going to actually walk into the bank. You're going to be schmoozing with the bank teller. You're going to be telling her how your weekend was. You're going to be telling her how much you'd like to deposit. And there's going to be much more of an exchange. Yesh lachshosh sheyikashel bihistaklut asura uviriya miyuteret be'erva. There's more of a reason to be concerned that your eyes will start wandering downwards. And I leave the rest up to your imagination. V'lachein nir'eh. He says, it would seem to me, therefore, that in those circumstances you should not open a bank account in such a bank.
Isn't he saying that because it's more than one occasion, it's not just more than one occasion, it's more of a prolonged interaction with the woman who's improperly dressed. It's not just walking past her in a happenstance fashion. Right? You're actually engaging her in conversation and interaction.
Online banking solves it all.
That's right. There you go. But you got to watch out for the ads on the online banking. make sure you have a filter on your.
Kavachamer says if you have to go to the bank once a week.
Yeah.
That you should change your bank.
Right. He says v'yatera mizu.
Why can't you ask for a mail teller? It's inconceivable that there would be a bank without any mail.
Well, I mean, okay. So look what's in the headlines today. We got these guys who won't fly on the airplane unless they are seated next to a mail. At what point does the accommodation become reasonable or unreasonable? So how long am I supposed to wait at the bank? Okay, so let's see what he says. He says, "V'yatera mizu im halakuach yachol lahasdir cheshbonotav al yedei bikur bebank b'pam echat b'chodesh asur lo levaker sham pamim nosafot." He says, I'll go even further. He says, if you can consolidate your bank visits so that you only have to go to the bank once a month to make your deposits, then you're obligated to minimize the number of times that you go to the bank to interact with these immodestly dressed tellers. Because then you'd be considered a rasha if you
honey, I got to go to the bank. But you were just there yesterday. I got to check on my account. You know,
there an hour.
Right. So obviously there's something wrong here. So you have to. So basically you have to economize on your visits.
Doesn't he imply that you can go to that bank then?
Well, he says.
If he's telling you to economize, he's saying you can.
He says lechatchila. He says that you should try to avoid opening a bank account there. But he says, but more than that, if you already are in such a bank, you have to minimize your amount of visits. He says the Gemara says that there's a moral imperative of midas chasidus, he points out. It's, in other words, you're not in violation of halacha if you don't, but you should try your best to do this, to avert your gaze to the women doing the laundry, even when there's no other way for you to travel. Therefore, it would certainly be preferable to open a bank account somewhere else. The more careful you are, the more the blessing will be of infinite value to you. And he ends off by quoting something from the Chafetz Chaim. He says, "V'hinei yuyan b'Chafetz Chaim shehiksha." The Mamasechet Bava Basra Muvor Diim Yachol Alechet B'derech Acheret Afilu Shu Hotzei Meinav B'chol Zot Hu Nechshav L'Rasha D'lo Hayalo L'Hitkarev B'Hai Derech. The Gemara points out, like we just quoted before, that if you have the opportunity to travel a different route to get back to your house, and you dafka go where the women are doing the laundry, you're called a Rasha, even if you avert your gaze. The ilu bipsachim avur dekaimal and dimefshel alechas b'derech acheres v'lo mechavein lehanos me'isuri hana ein bazeh iser. And yet, when it comes to the laws of Hilchos Pesach, there's a halacha as follows: you're not supposed to dafka go on Pesach to walk past the bakery so that you can go chametz, right? You're not supposed to do that. But let's say it's not your intention. Let's say you walk to work every day past the bakery. There's no requirement to dafka go a different route on Pesach as long as it's not your intention. So the question is, why is there a difference when it comes to the Isser Hana of Chametz, where there's no requirement to take a different route, whereas when you're walking by the women doing the laundry, even if your intention is not to get Hana, even if you're going to avert your gaze, you're called a Rasha if you walk past that, if you take that route. That's the question. So that's what the Chafetz Chaim asks, and he answers as follows: "It's v'tiretz Chafetz Chaim de ba'arayos nafshel shel adam mechamdasan." That when it comes to forbidden relationships, there's really very hard for a person to control himself. And therefore, you have to always be more machmir. He says, people have lots of taivas for chametz, but it doesn't compare to taivas for other things. Because even if now you say, I'm already an old man, my desires have been abated, I'm not interested in this stuff anymore, and you say it holds no mystique for me. He says, nonetheless, yesh lachshoch sheyitgaber alav yitzro ba'al korcho. But you never know. Al tamin ba'atzmachad yom mosecha. Don't trust yourself until the day you die. It's probably the most cautionary tale of these whole events that have been in the news recently about this rabbi. Right? He says, "V'chein matzinu bekama mekomo shechmiru yoser beinyanei ha'istaklos mikol ha'isurim shebetorah af below efshar v'lo mechavein yu'in sham." And that's what we find, that the poskim are more machmir when it comes to issues of looking at things that you're not supposed to look at, more than all other isurim in the Torah, even when it's very difficult to avert your gaze. And therefore, in our case also with the bank tellers, you should certainly be machmir whenever possible. And therefore, if you could open a bank account in another bank, where there's immodesty. And he says people change banks all the time. Sometimes people will change their bank because they want to get a better interest rate or because they want to get the free toaster. Right? So obviously there are reasons to change your bank. He says, "Im kein vaday she'alav la'azov bank ksheyesh chashash chamor shel isur Torah de lo sasuru." It is, and then sure, certainly it's kedai for you to change banks if there's a possibility of violating the prohibition of lo sasuru acharei levavchem v'acharei einechem. But of course, you have to remember that there are limits. There are certain litmus tests of reasonability. If the only place where all the banks in this area, let's say, are the same, they're all the same kind of nice lady who dresses basically the same way, but you have to travel all the way to, I don't know, somewhere very far away in order to open a bank account. It could be that you have to go to Muncie, right, in order to find a bank, right? You're not required to cross the border to go to Muncie in order to be able to find a decent bank. So there are limitations even to this tshuva, but with all things being equal, if you can find a bank, even if it's a little bit further away, says Reb Zilberstein, then you're obligated to do so. Look, we've seen two different themes in our short discussion tonight. One has to do with the concept of hezek re'iyah, where we see that there's this imperative to establish modesty, even with the most innocuous of activities. You have to be sensitive to people's rights to privacy. But certainly when it comes to the prohibition of lo sasur acharei levavchem, you have to be even more careful to avoid walking past or putting yourselves in situations where there's the possibility of seeing things that are untoward or that might lead a person to sinful behavior. And that's certainly one of the cautionary tales that we could take from all of the things that we've been reading about. No one is immune to these kinds of temptations. Everyone is susceptible to this, and therefore we all have to take very, very important lessons from this and try to apply them to our own lives. Okay. Yes.
Just from a halachic point of view, if one of these ladies, I guess, feels that he was spying on her, what's her damages halachically? Nezek, Sar, Ribui, Boshes?
Well, that's I pointed out earlier on. The Gemara doesn't seem to be saying that there's legal damages that a person can collect for hezek re'iyah. The only thing that you can do is coerce a person after the fact to cease and desist. But there may be penalties. Any court has a right to impose penalties as they see fit, and certainly if Dina de Malchusa Dina dictates that monetarily this is punishable by a certain fine. Voyeurism is punishable with a certain fine that the courts have already had on the books for years. Then it's certainly within their right to impose that, and the person would have to abide by that. I would go even further. My suspicion would be, although I cannot confirm it, is that even in a Beis Din might feel it appropriate to impose penalties, even though normally we generally say that there's no dinei knas in Chutz La'aretz in general, but there might be situations where a Beis Din might feel that it's appropriate to impose some kind of penalty on a perpetrator like this. I can't imagine in today's world that this would ever come before a Beis Din. I mean, this is criminal activity, so generally criminal activity goes to the secular court, doesn't go before a Beis Din. And I hope that no Beis Din would allow itself to enter into the jurisdiction of such a case. If something ever did come to a group of Rabbanim about any person who was peeping Tom, I would hope that the advice that the Rav would give to the individual who has this knowledge would be to report this immediately to the authorities and not to allow the rabbis to, don't worry, we'll handle this. That's not the appropriate behavior. That's not the appropriate response. There are certain criminal activities that the Rabbanim should not be dealing with. And even if they've dealt with them in the past, we have to do tshuva for that. If there have been cases of criminal activity, of molestation, of other kinds of crimes that have been committed in the community, there have been times in previous years when Rabbanim would feel, mitornisht, shashtil, we'll take care of it under the cover of, the Beis Din, we'll handle it our own way. That's not lo zu haderech. That's not right. It's not right. That's not good for Klal Yisrael. That's not good for the Jewish community. It's certainly not good for the victims of those crimes, who certainly are not being attended to in the way that they need to. So, you may argue that sometimes it seems like in society the pendulum has swung sometimes too far to the other direction. But that's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing. Sometimes when the pendulum swings so far to one direction, it's actually a good thing because it acts as a disincentive for these kinds of things happening in the future. So if an example needs to be made of this rabbi, assuming that he is guilty of what he is accused of having done in the newspapers and on the internet, then they should throw the book at him, and he should be made an example of, so that never let it be said that the Jewish community and the courts did not take something like this very, very seriously. Yeah.
We just had recently here in Canada the whole thing with Lev Tahor. We've all heaped a lot of ridicule and scorn on this sort of community or cult or whatever you want to call it. But aside from the fact that we don't know what they were really up to or what they are really up to behind the scenes, but the whole idea of the women dressing in body bags or whatever you want to call them, from what we're learning here, I mean, they're simply taking it to the next level.
Yeah, well, first of all, I just want to point out, I've never publicly condemned Lev Tahor, at least not to my memory.
Oh, I have.
Okay, but your pulpit's not as big as mine. Right?
It's a fully pulpit.
Everyone's got a pulpit. But the thing is that I think that's exactly the point, David. The point is that when you take something to extremes, that's when you cause the damage. Right? And the damage is not the ideal of tznius. Everyone believes in tznius. The damage is when you distort the ideal of tznius to take it to an extreme where you go well beyond the halachic norms that are deemed appropriate for what's even called das Yehudis, which is the way Chazal describe societal norms of tznius that go beyond halachic norms. For example, there's no halacha that requires a woman to wear opaque stockings, but if you live in a community where women wear opaque stockings, das Yehudis requires all the women to wear in that community opaque stockings. But let's say you design your own.
Women took on themselves, so das Yehudis?
Yeah, sometimes. Sometimes the women themselves took it upon themselves. But let's say you design your own cloistered community that's completely separate from all other halachic norms or even das Yehudis norms from any other community. That's where the danger comes in. Is that when you go to extremes like that, that's a sign that there's an aberration within the community that is unhealthy and that we need to distance ourselves from. So I'm not suggesting that these people go out and be stoned to death. I'm not suggesting that they be penalized or punished in a harsh way, but they either have to learn how to conform to the norms of Jewish communities worldwide, whatever community it is, whether it's Satmar, whether it's Belz, Ger, or even a modern Orthodox community, but conform to some established norms within Jewish society, or go somewhere else. We don't want you as part of our community because you're creating a distorted reality, a distorted perception. You're creating a chilul Hashem, and that's not something that we feel is healthy for Klal Yisrael.
Rabbi, you spoke about looking into it. What about doing something like sitting on a porch and watching the traffic go by, watching how your neighbors go by there? Or spying on your neighbors.
Well, that's different. You just, watching the cars go by is fine. You're sitting on your porch and just getting fresh air on a nice spring or summer day is perfectly fine.
Making a habit of it. Sitting there watching people go by.
It depends. It depends on your. It's a public area. It depends on your intention. If your intention is to see when your neighbor comes in and out of their house, that's a violation of their privacy. But if your intention is just to sit out and get fresh air, there's nothing wrong with it.
What really was the meaning or not?
Okay.